Hello all, and welcome back to a new episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we are going to be reviewing and discussing the film September 5th. Okay, Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for September 5th?
During the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, Germany, an American sports broadcasting team must adapt to live coverage of the Israeli athletes being held hostage by a terrorist group.
All right, so we are here at the end of our slew of Oscar movies, and this one's rounding us out as we get prepped for award season. So excited to be talking about this movie. This was not on my radar that much before the Oscar noms, so very exciting to get to watch this movie. What about you?
Yeah, I hadn't really heard much about this other than friend of the pod Michael from Screen Nerds Pod was really excited to see this film. And so he did a review of it. And that, I think, was the only person that I had heard talking about this until the Oscar nominations.
Wow. Michael does a great job of finding like niche gems of movies that he always brings to the table. So I love that. Okay, well, let's dive in and start with our one-sentence summaries for September 5th. Sarah, what is yours?
Mine is, sports journalists are journalists too.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. They seem to think so, you know?
I mean, they did do the thing.
Oh my goodness.
Kind of.
Yeah, with some questionable decisions along the way. My one-sentence summary is, stop the scooping.
Indeed.
Can we not be chasing the scoop ferociously?
Aw, no fun, Jen. No fun.
You know, while it is adrenaline-inducing, this film is not shy about showing all the implications of the scoop chasing. So, all right, well, let's dive in. Let's share our high-level thoughts about September 5th before we give a spoiler alert. So we will not spoil this movie quite yet. Sarah, what are your thoughts about this film?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I had a great time with it. So I love The Newsroom, which is written by my guy, Aaron Sorkin. And this is like a grittier version of The Newsroom. And I just had a great time. The film is so effective in creating so much tension when a lot of times it's just people talking to one another. And yet, because of all of the editing and the way that this is paced and the script and the constantly cutting back and forth between all these people, it's thrilling to watch. And then I also just appreciate the fact that they were able to intercut real footage of what went on. I didn't know about this event. So it was really cool that they were able to bring like so much of the history into it without it feeling, at least it didn't feel like this for me. It didn't feel like gimmicky or anything, but it felt organic and it made sense for the film. So all in all, I had a great time.
Yeah. I really was surprised at how much I really liked this film. Because usually when we go in and watch a movie, I feel like we have kind of a sense of how we might feel about it based on the headlines and the reviews and all of the film people that we follow and some of their opinions. And sometimes those gap in expectations are really fun when something surprises us or something was overhyped and we're like, I don't get it. And this was a film where I feel like I really truly went in with a white canvas and a totally blank slate. Like, knew very little about the movie and knew very little about people's thoughts about the movie. And I really enjoyed it. I thought that so many of the choices that this film makes are incredibly smart. They're very nuanced. I almost feel like this film would deepen with a second watch because there's so many small conversations and comments between the main characters that we're following that feel really significant. I think that this film structurally does an incredible job of keeping us with our protagonists. I guess it's questionable if you want to call them that. Well, they do their best. You know what I mean? They're men trying to do their best, but make some questionable choices along the way. But I appreciate that we're with our main characters for the bulk of the movie. And I don't know. I feel like the slew of Oscar-nominated movies that we've been watching recently, I've just been noticing how much they don't lean into sensationalizing a lot of really sensitive topics. And this is another film that I think does a really elegant job of staying with the meat of the film and what it wants to show, and not choosing to give us the big splashy, flashy moments. And it's very much in line with almost the larger thesis of the film as well, of what we do with our stories and how much we overlean sometimes into like igniting emotion just because that's what gets views and that's what gets engagement. And so I appreciate the film kind of is modeling what it looks like to tell a story, but choose to do it from a totally different angle. And then I also just really appreciate how much we spend a lot of time with our 3, and I would argue maybe 4 main characters if we add Marianne into the mix, and all of their competing perspectives and the way that some of them get intoxicated by the adrenaline of this, and then the way that some of the ones that were maybe the dissenting voices and choosing to raise doubts about their choices also get swept along with it along the way. So I just really appreciate seeing kind of the interactions between all 4 of them, and I feel like that added so much dimension to this film that is a pretty straightforward concept, but there's a lot of nuance here.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I really appreciated about it too. Like, I'm going to compare it to The Newsroom again, but what I loved that September 5 does that The Newsroom struggles to do is that it brings in that nuance and doesn't have as rosy a picture of journalism. You know, I love The Newsroom. I love Aaron Sorkin. I need that hopefulness in my life, but it is this very like through rose-colored glasses view at journalism. And September 5 takes a much, I think, more grounded approach. Even if at the beginning it is a little bit more hopeful, it definitely doesn't shy away from those more difficult things and the maybe negative side of journalism and weighing some real things with journalism ethics that I liked. And like you said, there's so many characters in this, and the 4 main ones that we follow, at times they almost seem to have competing interests, even though they're on the same team. And that's fascinating to watch kind of who wins out in that moment, especially when these people are having to make really significant decisions just on the fly and without any time to stop and think and consider. And we just see them kind of doing their best with their gut reactions. And sometimes they do the right thing and sometimes they do the wrong thing. And then we have to watch kind of how they respond to that. And I appreciate how well-rounded this film is when it could have maybe taken a bit more of a glossier approach, but it deliberately chooses not to go that route, and I think that makes it a better film.
I also think that the power dynamics between the 4 of them is really interesting. There's clearly respect, I think, that they all have for each other. I think that's apparent, but there's very subtle power dynamics that happen based on the roles that each of them play within the team too, that changes the way that they feel like they can or can't show up or voice their differing opinions or not. And it's interesting to see the way that the Aldridge will voice an opinion in a direction, and then you see the other 2 begin to compromise and fold a little bit because he is the boss and because he's calling the shots. And some of them will try and put up a little bit more of a fight and argue and have that healthy debate about what they should do next. But you kind of see that he carries a lot of weight. And I feel like that nuance and the inclusion of that is so helpful because so many people are working in larger organizations and also feel that same tension of like, morally, like, this doesn't feel quite right. Like, this does not sit right. I have voiced it, but my higher ups, the powers that be, are saying that we need to go in this direction. And how do you reconcile those competing tensions and those loyalties of doing the right thing, but also having to like maintain the piece of the system and having to kind of yield to the person that has like hired you, you know? And I think all of those dynamics are very much in full display. And they're not the point of the film, but I so appreciate how much the film includes all of the detailed nuances of that in this movie.
Yeah, and I think that helps make it more relatable too, because I mean, how many of us have been in a situation where we're covering something like this? No. But we've all been in a situation maybe at work where you know a course of action is right and your boss says no, or they want you to do something and you know that that's not right, but you feel that tension. And I do appreciate that this film makes us sit in that tension too. And then we see the fallout from it. You know, we see the result of their actions, and the film doesn't like gloss over it, but we actually like sit in it. And I think that that's a really valuable part of this film as well.
There's a point related to this that I want to make, so I'm going to give a spoiler because it has to do with how some of the characters make choices at the end. So, if you haven't seen September 5th yet, go check it out. It is available to rent and to stream and to buy on all of the platforms, so we recommend watching this movie. Sounds like both Sarah and I really enjoyed this movie as well, and would highly recommend it. So, we recommend checking it out before listening to the rest of our conversation. Okay, so while we're talking about the character dynamics and kind of some of the choices and pressures that they make and are responding to, one of the things that I love that the film does is that it has Bader initially be the voice of dissent. And I'm rooting for him so hard. Like, he is the one that is boldly pulling Aldridge out of the hallway and saying, what are we doing here? Like, are we missing the people and the humanity and the lives here, and all of the implications of what it means to have a hostage situation like this broadcast for thousands of millions of people to see and their families. Like, his intuition is so spot on. And yet he then quickly abandons it when the report comes through that confirms that the hostages are free. And so he's like, oh, well, I guess maybe I overreacted. Like, I guess we should just move forward. But then I love that Mason is the one for the bulk of the movie. For the majority of the movie, he is like intoxicated by all of this. Like, he is a man on a mission and he's here to get the scoop and almost will do it at all costs and really kind of has tunnel vision. But I love that the two of them kind of flip by the end of the film in that final sequence where it's Mason who's advocating for, we need to correct the reporting on this. Like, we need to go on air and talk about how we got it wrong. And I just appreciate that because it might be easy to paint Bader as kind of the hero and the dissenting opinion and the voice of reason and the moral compass. And Mason is the one that kind of got swept up by it all. But I appreciate that they kind of flip by the end and really showcases how we as human beings have the capacity to lean into all of these different forces and voices in our heads that are speaking truth and are our moral center, and maybe also are easily swept up in the adrenaline of it all. And we can choose who we listen to and to make things right. And I just love that the film doesn't paint any of these men into easy buckets, but they kind of all showcase the full spectrum of being swept up by this whole endeavor, and then also being able to have the intuition and the moral compass to say, hey, we need to correct this. We messed up and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, they all feel like real people who are in the middle of a crisis. And when you're in a crisis and you're just having to go, like, the best and the worst parts of you come out. And I feel like that's what we see in this film. And you're right, nobody is a villain and nobody is a hero. And they're all just flawed people making decisions at this really tense moment. And sometimes they make the wrong decisions. And I love that the film kind of ends there, where they're like, oh crap, what did we do? And it's sitting in that emotion. And then and we'll see you tomorrow.
And also, good job.
Right? Like, you have to keep going.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a fascinating aspect of this too. You know, the film could have ended a couple minutes earlier than it did, where they're just like sitting in the emotion of it. It's done. This event is over. But I appreciate those extra couple of minutes where we see them cleaning up, telling each other, we'll see you tomorrow. The show must go on. And I think that that's also a really interesting thing for even like us to grapple with, of there's always so much going on in the world, and yet we have to continue on. And that's just a tension that we constantly have to live with. And so I appreciate the film also brought that into this really dramatic hostage film.
And I think the feeling of time pressure, the film through editing and camera work and kind of the pacing and intensity of that newsroom did a great job of capturing, where they genuinely don't have a lot of time to ponder the implications of a lot of decisions that they're making. You know, it's like moment by moment, second to second. And if they miss it, like that's the missed opportunity to get the shot, whatever that means. But I think that adds a layer of, maybe empathy is the right word, of like how a lot of them maybe are in that like heightened mental state where they are desensitized from the humanity of what they're covering, because they're kind of in go mode. They've got the tunnel vision. They have a job to do. And I think Mason, his character does an incredible job of showcasing this, because he is in the operations room and he's directing all of the cues, where he doesn't have time, literally, emotionally, to think about what is happening and what they're filming. And I love the film, like you mentioned, ends with the shot of him sitting down in his car, almost finally allowing the emotions of the day hit him, because there was no space beforehand and he was just in go mode. There's a really great shot of him cleaning up in the room and spending a few moments to just look at the photos of the victims of the hostage crisis and of the attack. And you can feel the weight of that as he's walking to his car. And it really feels like the whole day's worth of emotional processing is now going to begin now, because there was no space for it, really. They're under such pressure that there's no capacity that they have to really think about this deeply.
And I think the film does a great job of showcasing all of that, because it's all happening so quickly, and you know, it's edited very quickly and a lot of quick shots, and you're going back and forth between people, and you're seeing just the madness of this crew trying to figure out how to get this coverage. The whole tenor of the film makes it clear that they don't have time to actually like sit and think about it. It's just frenetic going. And yeah, then by the time it ends, I feel like it hits all of us of like, oh crap. So the film does a great job creating empathy in us for all of these people as they're doing this very difficult job.
And I think another interesting few shots in this film that really made me think and feel like such important contributions to the thesis of the film is there's one. It's very brief, but it's while the broadcast is happening and they're talking about like the deaths and the fear around the situation. And there's a short like pan over of the camera to a few of the workers that are watching a boxing match, and they're like cheering in the background. And then it like pans over to the screen where the broadcast is happening. And there's the juxtaposition of that contrast of like, we're talking about like lives that are being lost and that are in danger, and yet these men are watching boxing like right in the same room. And at first there's a little bit of like, man, that seems kind of like cold and harsh to like turn a blind eye to what's literally unfolding in their midst, just a couple of hundred of feet away from them. But then you think about yourself, you know, and you think about all of the news and the horrors that we're inundated with every day, and the limited capacity that we as human beings have to hold such traumatic information all at once, and that need for respite, that need for levity to kind of take a break from it all. Like I thought that the whiplash of emotion that I felt in that scene of like initial horror, but then also empathy, but then also horror, but then realizing like, oh, like we do this all the time too. Like things are happening in our midst, and yet we are living our lives and trying to survive and trying to find a moment of joy some way that we can, and how do you reckon with all of that? How do we be empathetic and engaged and care deeply about what's happening with around us, while also not getting swept up and being like literally swept into the depths of the emotion of like every single thing that's happening in our news feeds? And I think that prompted a whole thought train, because I know that there's a lot of conversations right now around the news and the volume and velocity in which we hear bad news around the world, and the kind of desensitizing effect and the numbing effect it has on us. And that is so real. And I feel like this film is touching on that in these subtle ways by showcasing the way that all of these workers are figuring out how to survive in this environment, and that numbing is part of the survival that they need to get through what is their jobs. And then for us, it's our lives, And so thinking about the implications of that and how complicated that is was, I think, a whole thought train that I had while watching this movie.
And I love that this movie does that. Like, obviously this takes place in 1972 and is about this very specific moment in history. But it's not just about that. And I feel like everything in this film is relevant to our lives today, which is very wild. But just, I mean, props to the writers of this script for obviously telling a really gripping story and a very effective story, but also weaving so much humanity in there so that we can extrapolate these themes out that are applicable to our lives today. And I had so many moments like what you're describing throughout this film where I was thinking about how that relates to me and how I'm processing the news, or what I escape into, or thinking about a lot of journalists talking about their own ethics and how they decide to report on the news and what they decide to share. And like, journalist ethics is a big deal still today, and that's covered heavily in this film. So I appreciate that this film is able to take this event that happened decades ago and then pull out all of these themes that are still so relevant for us today to be thinking about and pondering.
The way that those themes are still so resonant, and probably if anything, like more prominent for us now that we have access to so much more technology and access to information, that the desensitizing effects of that are, if anything, stronger than they ever were. And we're all just trying to survive.
Yep. Most definitely. Yeah. One aspect of this film that I really loved is the emphasis on how tactile everything is. Like, obviously it's the 70s, so the technology was very different back then. But I loved watching this really scrappy crew just figuring out how to do stuff. And, I loved the moment when the woman was like, let's superimpose our logo on the footage. And I was like, oh yeah, like I know how we would do that today. I had no idea how they would do that in 1972. So I loved all of those little things, or how one of the audio guys, he rigged the phone up to the microphone so that they would have good quality audio going out and could talk to the reporter. Like, all of these little details, they were so tactile, and I loved them. I ate up every single one of them.
Yeah. Those bits were neat, especially because they have to move so quickly too. Again, that time pressure piece adds so much forward momentum in this film, because there's every moment they're scrambling to get to the next thing of like, oh my gosh, okay, they're at the airport. Like, we got to get some people at the airport. Who's going to the airport, And I think that adds so much adrenaline and momentum in this film. And somehow, it's an efficient 90-minute movie. And it flew by for me. Like, I think that they somehow were able to keep the intensity and momentum so high, and it's, if anything, compounding as the film is unfolding. And sometimes in films, you get the law of diminishing return. Like, when you especially keep the intensity that high and don't have those moments to breathe or come out or release attention, the hold of tension can kind of feel like, okay, what are we doing here now? Like, we've been in this tense state for a long time. It's feeling less tense than it was at the beginning of the movie. And this film did an incredible job. I'm sure it's partially the technical filmmaking aspects, but also just like I think the story itself feeling incredibly big and weighty, and we too are following it with our crew as well. So yeah, those moments where they're trying to figure out what they need, who needs to go there, and who's going to cover what, were thrilling.
One of the reasons why this film, I think, works so well is that even though it is tense the entire time, there are, number one, we're following so many different people. And so that makes it interesting and provides enough variation throughout that we can stay interested. But I think that there's also plenty of moments where there are these little tiny tonal shifts, and we have these moments of like levity and humor. So one of my favorite moments is when Gary, who is a worker who they are making him pose as a athlete.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Is then interviewed on TV. And I loved that moment. It was so funny. It was so quick. But I liked those little things. Or when, the sound guy asks the German interpreter to go get a cup of coffee, and then they need her. And in the next shot, he is bringing her a cup of coffee. Like, just these little tiny things that are these funny little moments throughout. So even though it's still tense, we can have this moment to like chuckle to ourselves, and then we can go back into the tense moments. And I think all of those breaks happen at really important times throughout the film so that we don't become fatigued. And then we see how all of these different characters are responding to the tension and the constant movement and the constant needing to get to the next thing. I think also helps our brains never get too bogged down in any one part of the story, because we're constantly bouncing back and forth in a way that's appropriately overwhelming. Like, it's not so overwhelming that you want to disconnect, but it's overwhelming enough that you're like, oh my gosh, are they going to be able to pull this off? So I think all of these components are present in the script, which is just so good. They absolutely nailed it.
They did. The pacing of this film is pretty incredible. One of the things that I really appreciated, and it employs it most in probably the first third of the film, perhaps, is just how long we spend having seen like none of the quote unquote the action. You know, like we are hearing of what's happening and all of the breaking news with our main characters. And I think that like another less skillful movie would have like cut to show little snippets of what's happening outside and showcasing some of the like atmosphere of that. And I just love that we don't get to see it. Like, we too are stuck in this room just hearing reports come through the radio, and we are also with our main characters imagining and trying to piece it together and getting little snippets here and there. And so I just love that we don't get to leave that space and we don't get more information than our main characters do. And the tension and the drama of that alone was so exciting for the first, I think, like 30 minutes of film. And it makes sense that only later on, as the story is developing, do our main characters start to see some of the footage, but then also we start to see some of the footage. So we are progressively gathering more insight and information and understanding the situation better as the film is unfolding. But I just love how long we spend just hearing things trickle in through random voices in the radio as we're trying to piece this all together, and are just as confused with our main characters. So it helps build empathy and investment, I think, in our main characters and kind of feeling like we're in their shoes and we're in it together with them. But it also, just from a like dramatic narrative storytelling perspective, adds so much tension and really carries us through that first act.
It's like Jaws, right? Like, you don't show the shark right away, but you hear everybody's reaction to the shark and you see the after effects of the shark. And then you don't see the shark until well into the film when it's, maximum impact. And I feel like this September 5 is playing with that as well, because you're right, just hearing about what's going on, our imaginations can run wild, just like these people's imaginations were probably running wild because they didn't know what's going on. And a lot of them, they're not from Germany. So they're also not in a familiar place. They don't speak the language. They don't know what's going on. Like, that is just a recipe for chaos and confusion. And the film does a really, really good job of highlighting all of that as they're trying to gain some semblance of knowledge about what has happened.
Yeah, they have to translate all the reports that are coming through and try and piece it together. And what's interesting is that they discuss the use of language and how they are talking about this, but like their understanding of the connotations of the reports that are coming in are also slightly skewed, or they're trying to do their best to accurately represent and report on something that is getting lost in translation as it's coming through too. So that was a whole fascinating piece too of that whole conversation that they have. I forget at what point, where they're trying to understand how the rest of the media, like how is the German media calling this event? Like, are they calling them terrorists? Or are they calling them attacks? Or are they calling them something different? And the connotations of words holding so much power is something that this film definitely is exploring, suggesting, and allowing us to ponder as one of the many, many, many themes that it's exploring. But I thought that was what in particular was really interesting because they're in a foreign country, like you mentioned.
Yeah, that's such a small moment, but again, is super relevant to our time, you know, like how many times are we debating what to call a thing that is happening that we can see on the news. And I love how that scene, again, it's short, but it brings in all of these different perspectives and everybody has a different opinion. And so how are we going to come to a consensus? But we have to come to the consensus right now because we are on the air. And so it's a really interesting conversation that relates to our world today and also creates so much additional tension and stakes because they have to say something because they're live on the air.
Yeah. And they're flying blind. Like, I think that's something that also was like very palpably felt by the vibe of the movie, which is like they have no idea. You know what I mean? And they're just kind of making calls as they go and flying by the seat of their pants, which I'm sure is very much a part of like live broadcasting and you're just having to make decisions. But the feeling of like, we just don't know, we gotta say something, but like the weight of what we say matters so much is just like such an interesting spot to be in, because in so many other parts of our life we have a little bit more time to consider our options, consider the implications, and make a really intentional choice, that especially for ones that carry so much weight, you know, and they don't have the luxury of that at all. So they're just like, we don't even have time to have a discussion about this. Like, you just gotta go on and like say some words and hope that we're representing it the best that we can. And just the way that they're having to move forward with such little information, I think, was definitely felt throughout the movie. This is not like a well-oiled machine that is very well connected and has a team of interpreters and has time to ponder and lag time to really ensure that it's crisp and polished as it's going on air. You're like, no, they have also no idea. So the "as we are hearing it" phrase really carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, that phrase is doing work.
Oh, that was one of those, this is not the right choice moments, but you're making it.
Right. But it's like, okay, when your boss says to do it, like, okay, but man, this is not the move, my guy.
Yeah, but then you're like, I don't know if I'm in his shoes, like, would I fare any better? No idea. You know, like you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, when you're under pressure, all the stuff comes out in us as human beings, and nothing like some time pressure and some corporate pressure to really like squeeze out some shady shit in us, you know?
Yeah, it's a perfect recipe for recipe. Yeah, not greatness.
No. Oh, it's so bad. It's what's rough too is that they use the competitive threat of like, if we don't do it, like CBS is going to do it or another station's going to do it and we're going to lose the opportunity to be first. And just the way that, I mean, it's capitalism, it's business. That's like how it's run. Like you need to be first in the market and to capture the audience and gain the momentum. Like I get it. I get why that mentality is there, but it's highly effective to get people to like really move faster than maybe they feel comfortable with. It's very effective.
So this is maybe my last newsroom reference is there is an episode of the newsroom where they cover this and it's a fictionalized retelling of the Gabby Giffords shooting in Tucson, Arizona. And I was living in Tucson at the time. I vividly remember this day. And it's fascinating to see how the newsroom grappled with that and they wanted to go and they wanted to make their announcement and break the news on TV, but they held it because they didn't have confirmation and they were waiting and the higher ups told them to go and they were like, no, we're not going. We don't have confirmation. And so it's just fascinating to see September 5 it's the exact same scenario, basically, when we're talking about the ethics of journalism. And September 5 shows what it looks like when you get it wrong. And I loved that. I love that we didn't have, like Marv was right in that conversation. He was like, no, you wait for confirmation. And they didn't listen to him. And we see what happens. And to horrifying results, too. Yeah. That little snippet at the end with 900 million people watching?
900 million.
900 million people watched the first time an act of terrorism was broadcast live. And so just millions, hundreds of millions of people getting that wrong information that they broadcasted. And then they have to go and clean it up, and going from this like highest of highs to the lowest of lows in a couple of minutes. Like that is just devastating. But I love that the film goes there and shows that and makes us sit in that, because that is a valuable thing to grapple with.
And what's neat is that we feel, for the most part, I don't know, our what's his name? Arledge is a little questionable. He's very much like a corporate machine game piece, I feel like, where he's here for the engagement and the views. But you can feel that Mason and Bader, I think, are trying their best within their capacity to do what they hope to be the right decision. I was thinking a lot about the Succession episode. I think it's in season 4, I want to say. If you haven't watched Succession season 4, stop listening to the next couple of minutes because we're going to spoil it. And that is a show that should not be spoiled. But in Succession season 4, I believe, where they actually are gunning to call the election even though they know they don't have the right votes in place yet to confirm it, so that because they know that the rest of the news sources will swing and follow them, and then that becomes truth. And so it's such a fascinating spectrum to think about. Over here, the Roy brothers, I think Shiv was like a little bit against it, but the Roy brothers were like intentionally using the way that the system works to tell their narrative for their gain. So very much obviously twisted motivations. We have some folks here in the middle that are like trying to do the right thing, but also very much not immune to like the corporate forces that are pressuring them and very much giving into them willingly sometimes, but also trying to raise some moral implications in some way. So like somewhat in the middle, probably where a lot of us lie. And then the newsroom, which is very much sounds like, I haven't watched the newsroom, but sounds like the best of us, like holding the line, setting the boundary, choosing to do the right thing in the face of the corporate powers that are pressuring them, and choosing not to air it. Like that full spectrum, this is a fascinating array that we have here of similar situations, understanding the dynamics at play, but using them for very different purposes. And I think that's what makes this film so compelling, is that we take the leap with these characters to trust that they are they're trying to do overall the right thing as best as they can, but they are also not immune and they are human. And I think that humanity in each of them makes them really interesting to watch because we feel like we can see a little bit more of ourselves in them. Whereas like, hopefully we're not the Roy brothers and we aspire to be the newsroom folks, but perhaps know that we are not immune to all of the forces that are at play.
We sadly don't live in a world written by Aaron Sorkin, and that makes my heart sad. It just is what it is. But you're so right. The flaws of these characters and their humanity helps make this film so interesting to watch. And we say it all the time. We love human characters. Like, we want them to be three-dimensional. We want them to be flawed. We want them to, you know, have successes and make mistakes just like the rest of us. And these folks, these hard-working professionals are just trying to do their best. And they're also just this scrappy team that is in this situation that they have no business being in and are just trying to figure out how to get through it. And there's something so endearing about that. Like, yeah. I don't know, in some ways, they're almost like an underdog. It's not that type of a story, but that's kind of what it feels like at times, where they're just trying to figure it out. They have no business being here, and you just can't help but root for them.
And that's a detail that I kept thinking back to and remembering to put this whole thing in context, which is like they were just sports journalists, you know? And there's that whole conversation that I think is really fascinating and very much reflective of corporate siloed organizational structures, which is when Arledge is on the phone with corporate and they say basically like, you're sports. You're in way over your head. And Arledge hangs up the phone. He's like, this is our story now and we're keeping it, you know? Like, that's some corporate stuff right there. But yeah, they're just sports journalists. And here they are all of a sudden in this impossible situation that is unfathomable. And they feel this responsibility to cover it. And I think what's interesting too is that their motivations are a little bit mixed and they all have little bits of different motivations and different intensities of it. So I really feel like Arledge is probably more on the spectrum of like, he sees this as an opportunity for him to like make gains and strides in his career and get the big promo and kind of break out of the kind of glass ceilings that he's been under. Cause I think he's in it for maybe a little bit more sinister reasons or self-gain perhaps. And then we see a lot of the rest of the workers are just like, okay, yeah, this is important and we need people to know what's happening here. So let's scrappy our resources together and try and figure this out. And I think we see the full spectrum of everybody having a little bit of all of that and different intensities. But they're sports journalists. Like, oh my gosh. I think that detail is important to like view so much of this film through and so many of the choices that they're making and why maybe it feels a little bit more chaotic too and why they make some questionable choices as well.
And I also love the emphasis, especially at the beginning, that Mason is not the A team here. You know? And even when like everything starts to go haywire, they try to find anybody else other than him. And he is the only one available. And then he becomes the one that all of the communication needs to flow through. And he is the one that has to have his hands in everything that's going on. And he is not their first choice. He is their last choice. And so I think that also helps us empathize with him even more. Like, he is the underdog and he's doing all of this stuff. We see him clicking all the buttons and directing everything and trying to hold it all together. And it's like, yeah, you go, buddy. You can do this. Even though they don't believe in you, you can do this. But that knowledge that he is not the person for this job, I think also adds to that chaos as well.
And he does, like, overall, I would say, like, a much better job than I would have expected, you know? Like, he really steps up and he's directing the camera and the cues and the title cards or the captions, like I loved seeing all of those details. So that was maybe my equivalent of your getting to see the tactile stuff, is just seeing how all of those small details are so perfectly orchestrated. Just in the past couple of weeks, I got a chance to like do showrunner stuff for a podcast that I help out with, and getting to see how much every little detail is like agonized over, and what goes into the final product is so intentional and takes so many human bodies to put together, was really illuminating. And Mason has to figure out how to do so much of that on the fly. And it was fascinating too to see the way that he would use language in a specific way around like punch-ins and things like that. And you're like, we're punching into literally like a hostage situation. Like this, it's that jarring feeling of like, we're treating this like it's a production, like a literal show, but also this is like real life. And that, I think, was also maybe a theme of this film as well. That was fascinating because there's so much show business-esque vibes that are going on here and dynamics that are happening here. But also the reality of the cognitive truth, this is real life and these are human lives on the line, is like constantly invading as we're seeing the behind the scenes of it all.
Yeah, because you got to keep people watching and they can't go to a competitor. And so you have to keep them here. And I again, that's that whole thing of when you're in a crisis, when you don't have time to think, you just react. And it's probably muscle memory for him to be directing things like he was. And there's no time to actually process what is going on. And so you just revert back to what you know. And he knows how to do sports stuff. So that's what they're doing. And I think, man, it's just such an interesting piece in all of this that obviously we as the viewers sitting on our couches at home, we can be thinking about like, hey, this is not a good idea, but they don't have the mental capacity to think about that in that moment until finally it hits them in the face.
Yeah. When they sit in their car at the end of the workday and they're like, oh my gosh, what just happened? What was I a part of? What? That quietness of that final shot is genius. Because honestly, we as the viewers also did not have time to process a lot of this either. So like I'm sitting in the car with Mason being like, wow, like your mind is just racing with everything that we've just consumed, and imagining how they felt in that instance is yet another leap. We're just sitting here on our couches, you know, also overwhelmed. Imagine being in that room.
Yeah, no thank you.
We're sitting here eating snacks watching this unfold, okay? Yeah. Like, we have nothing. We're out here judging, being like, well, why'd you make that decision, huh? Like how we not thought about this. We're like, they ain't got that time to think about any of that. They don't even got time to eat and pee and, you know, like take care of themselves. They're like, literally, it's following moment by moment, breaking news, breaking updates.
Yeah. No, not for me. Thank you.
One of the other conversations that I'm like, man, this film just deserves a second rewatch. There's so much goodness here, but it was one that really struck me is when Bader is pulled Arledge aside and is talking about like, hey, let's think about the implications of this. And I think one of them asked, can we show someone being shot on live television? And they all just like are like, we don't know. But I loved how there's the previous scene where Arledge says, this is our story in response to corporate and we're keeping it, put the camera in the right place, right? And kind of that's setting up the second part of that arc, which is Bader saying, whose story is this? Is it ours or is it theirs? And kind of the weightiness and the responsibility of understanding that, like, while it might seem like it's their story to tell because they've got the scoop and they're following it, that there are like implications for the stories they put out there, and like just Bader kind of pointing them back to like, no, we have a responsibility here when we put something out into the world. It is no longer just ours. It affects all of the people that are being represented, their families that are invested in this. And I think that is such a fascinating way to think about or connect to the way we talk about movies too, which is a topic that we are often fascinated by here on the pod, which is when creators and film directors and writers tell stories, like there are implications when that story is birthed into existence and is now being consumed by the masses. And so it is not just that director, that creator, that writer's story to tell, but like they are telling other people's story. And I just love that the scene cuts away right after he says, is it ours or is it theirs? And like, we don't answer that question. It just kind of hangs in the air and really invites us as the viewers to also ponder that of like, when art is created of any kind and stories are being told, it is now a shared story and it affects so many other people beyond just the people that are telling it. And so I appreciated Bader's understanding of that and expanding the view of ownership of stories for this crew. But I think it's also notable that the film chooses not to have a clean answer to that question because it is much more complex than just a binary question. But the invitation to ponder that idea of there are collective stories being told and we all have a responsibility in stewarding it is significant.
Yeah, and we see how this is still playing out today. I kept thinking about how does a journalist decide how much to include? Because like these guys, how do you keep people informed without kind of elevating the terrorists and cause further harm to the families? And it made me think how, you know, over the years I've heard some like pivots when, you know, like mass shootings happen or somebody releases a manifesto and the news organizations being very deliberate to not use the perpetrator's name, but instead to elevate the victims' names instead, to prevent some of that notoriety from happening. And that was something that I kept thinking about while watching is what is that balance and how do you find that balance, especially in a situation like this that is very fluid and you don't have all of the information, and what do you do? What is the balance between informing without causing harm? And you know, we see what these guys do in the heat of the moment, but it's just such an interesting thing to think about, and how those things that we learn kind of shape how we view events of the day as well. Because the news and what we consume, it does affect us. So those decisions that are being made behind a news desk or in a newsroom, they do have an effect on us. So it's just kind of interesting to think about what do those processes look like and what are the values that inform those things, so that in the heat of the moment, you know what decision you're going to make. Obviously, these are sports journalists. This is not their purview. They were not prepared for this, but it's still, I don't know, it's just an interesting thing for me to kind of think about more broadly about, you know, journalism and the ethics behind like what you report and how.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And like who has the like responsibility and the right to be able to make those decisions too is a really fascinating choice. And like, how are those decision structures set up? Like in this case, it's a lot of just like Mason making some choices and then also like Arledge kind of directing and overseeing a lot of those choices. And that's a lot of control and power over the narrative that like is consolidated within the hands of a few men, but also like the kind of decision by committee doesn't work in a situation that this time sensitive as well. So how do you have those right balancing forces, but also the ability to move efficiently and follow the story in a timely way? We don't have answers. I mean, this is complex stuff, but the way the film invites us to ponder all of the difficulties and challenges of that, I think is really important too. And the implications of how they talk about what they show, all of that is, and maybe there's some things, for example, that we can put into place ahead of time and do the right trainings on to have like policies or stances in place that are like known by the employees of our company. You know, like I think that question that one of them asked, like, can we show someone being shot on live television? Like, great question. Let's figure out some of these answers to some of these scenarios maybe before we're in the actual situation, so that we're well equipped and well prepared to be able to navigate and kind of all be on the same page and aligned on what we want to show or not show, or talk about or not talk about.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to think about what a different time it must have been in 1972. Like, we weren't alive in 1972, but it wasn't that long ago. But our world is so different now. And there have been so many tragedies that have happened over the decades. There's been so many terrorist attacks over the decades, you know? And so I wonder if even, say, like the sports world would be more prepared for something like that today than they would have been then. And obviously technology is very different. But because we've seen more acts like this happen, like,
yeah,
maybe there wasn't as much of a need to have a plan in 1972 because maybe these types of acts didn't happen as often, or maybe they were more localized and, you know, world news wasn't maybe as quick as it is today. That's also an interesting component. And I love that September 5 spends so much time at the beginning of the film really grounding us in 1972 and how groundbreaking this technology was to be able to broadcast all over the world and showing us all of these facets of the broadcast and how revolutionary it is, because we live in a completely different world today. We're still grappling with a lot of these same themes, but our world looks very, very different. So I needed that rooting because, man, I don't know what that 1972 world was like.
And the way that we are probably briefed and trained differently now too for gatherings of mass scale, and how personnel, workers, press are probably far more equipped to respond in a way that is appropriate, that is intentional, that is thoughtful, and also handling the situation with grace and care. I'm sure everybody that training, I'm sure, exists far more significantly now than it did in 1972. So yeah, I think that's a really fascinating point of this was truly something that was so unexpected for them that they're responding to maybe for the first time, and for a lot of the workers on the scene. Okay, any other last big things that we wanted to mention about September 5? I know there's probably a lot, but any big things that we wanted to mention?
I just want to shout out our girl, Marianne.
Yeah.
She is fantastic. Oh my gosh. There are so many scenes where she is in this really loud environment where all of these men are yelling, and then she has, her earphones on, listening to something in German, and then she's having to translate what's going on to the loud men who are running around. And I was just like, oh my gosh. Obviously she's a translator and that's her job, but holy moly, this film does a great job of just showing how difficult a job that is, and for her to remain so calm and composed all throughout when this is her home and these are her people. And obviously the film does a great job of showing the weight of the previous time that the games were in Germany, and all of that, and that personal shame, the shame that the Germans had as a country, and she's grappling with all of these complex things, and she still has to do her job, and she does her job so well, rolling with the punches, doing what needs to be done. I loved Marianne. She was great.
I love the way that we're introduced to her too, where I think it's Bader that throws a sly remark at her around a photo of the Holocaust and whatnot. And it's like, were your parents, aware of this? And she's like, I am not them. And she holds her own. She speaks calmly, but she also, throws it back at him and is like, F you. This is a new generation. Why are you coming at me with all of this intention and emotion? You know what I mean? So I love that we get to see that tenacity paired with such calmness and rootedness and grace that she has. And she, yeah, she handles that situation quite well. I would have flipped off. Excuse you, sir.
Right? Like, please put some respect on Marianne's name.
Yeah.
I also loved the moment when the audio engineer asks her for a cup of coffee and she just stares at him and then like goes away. But then in the next time we see her, then she's listening to something and he brings her a cup of coffee and she accepts it without being like a total jerk to him, which I would have been. Like, I would have put him on blast in that moment, and she didn't. She is just professionally doing her job, and she knows that he is ashamed enough, and she doesn't need to pile on. And I just thought that that was very classy, and I loved it.
Yeah, she was great. And she's just literally surrounded in a room of very stressed out men. So good on her. She's the calming force, honestly, for me as a viewer watching this whole thing unfold. I'm like, okay, she's got her sanity in check and sound judgment that is somehow still intact. We're going to be okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is our review and discussion of September 5. You can find it available, as we mentioned, to stream. We highly recommend checking out this film. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. Our name sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories, so everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune to your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review, letting us know your thoughts about September 5th. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at MoviesAndUsPod, or email us at moviesandUsPod@gmail.com. This episode was edited by Melvin Benson from Cinematic Doctrine. Check out his show for more great movie conversations. We hope you have an amazing week. We'll see you soon, and we'll be back next week to discuss all of our Oscar predictions, which will be a very fun episode. So make sure to circle back for some more Oscar conversations with us.